China has turned Mexico into its secret weapon against America, and Washington is walking into the trap with eyes wide shut. You may not want to hear this analysis, but the strategic encirclement of the United States is already complete. What we're witnessing isn't random economic cooperation between neighboring countries. It's the systematic conversion of America's southern border into a Chinese staging area for economic warfare, demographic manipulation, and industrial espionage. The intelligence reaching my sources in Washington reveals a disturbing pattern that most analysts have missed. Chinese manufacturing facilities in Mexico aren't just producing goods for global markets. They're producing strategic materials for Chinese military applications while exploiting USMCA provisions that grant Mexican products preferential access to American markets. When conflict comes between America and China, Mexico won't be neutral territory. Mexico will be Chinese territory, operating under Mexican sovereignty, but serving Chinese strategic objectives. The USMCA agreement, celebrated as a victory for American trade policy, has become China's most effective tool for penetrating American markets while avoiding American oversight. Chinese companies establish Mexican subsidiaries that qualify for USMCA benefits while remaining Chinese-controlled operations. Chinese goods flow through Mexican facilities that add minimal value but gain Made in Mexico labels that bypass American tariffs designed to limit Chinese economic influence. Mexican government cooperation with Chinese penetration reflects economic desperation rather than strategic choice. Chinese investment offers immediate benefits without political strings, while American investment comes with democracy promotion requirements that limit Mexican policy autonomy. But Mexican leaders fundamentally misunderstand the long-term implications of Chinese economic integration. Chinese investment creates dependencies that gradually transfer decision-making authority from Mexican institutions to Chinese entities. The demographic weapon represents the most insidious aspect of Chinese strategy in Mexico. Chinese facilitation of migration flows through Mexico to America, serves multiple Chinese strategic objectives simultaneously. Migration creates domestic American political instability that distracts American attention from Chinese activities while generating opposition to American international commitments. Migration provides cover for Chinese intelligence operations that embed agents within refugee populations while creating opportunities for surveillance of American border security systems. More importantly, Chinese facilitated migration undermines American social cohesion and economic stability in ways that traditional military threats cannot address. When American domestic politics focus on border security rather than great power competition, Chinese expansion proceeds without American interference. When American resources address immigration consequences rather than strategic challenges, Chinese capabilities develop without American constraint. Chinese strategy exploits American humanitarian impulses and legal obligations to create problems that serve Chinese strategic interests. Drug trafficking networks provide another dimension of Chinese strategic penetration that exploits Mexican sovereignty to damage American society. Chinese chemical companies provide precursor chemicals for fentanyl production while maintaining plausible deniability about end-use applications. Chinese logistics networks facilitate drug transportation while appearing to serve legitimate commercial purposes. Chinese financial systems launder drug profits while expanding Chinese economic influence throughout Mexican banking sectors. The fentanyl crisis alone kills more Americans annually than most wars while generating profits that fund Chinese strategic operations throughout Latin America. Chinese chemical exports to Mexico have increased dramatically since 2020, despite Chinese government awareness that these chemicals serve illegal drug production rather than legitimate industrial applications. Chinese government tolerance for chemical exports reflects strategic calculation that drug-related American social damage serves Chinese interests by weakening American society from within while creating additional migration pressures and border security challenges. The automotive industry exemplifies Chinese strategy for using Mexico as a platform for penetrating American markets while avoiding American oversight. Chinese electric vehicle companies establish Mexican manufacturing facilities that produce vehicles for American consumption while maintaining Chinese control over critical technologies and supply chains. Chinese battery companies provide energy storage systems for American grid infrastructure while maintaining ability to disrupt American energy security during crises. Chinese automotive expansion in Mexico serves dual purposes of establishing Chinese industrial presence near American markets, while creating dependencies that could cripple American transportation systems during conflicts. When Chinese companies control significant portions of American automotive supply chains through Mexican operations, Chinese economic warfare becomes automatically devastating regardless of Mexican government preferences. Tesla's reliance on Chinese battery technology in Mexican plants demonstrates how American companies become unwitting participants in Chinese strategic penetration. Chinese agricultural investments in Mexico establish control over American food security through Mexican suppliers. Chinese agricultural companies invest in Mexican food production that supplies American markets while establishing Chinese control over American food security. Chinese seed companies provide genetically modified crops to Mexican farmers that create dependencies on Chinese agricultural technologies while compromising American agricultural independence. Chinese control over Mexican agricultural exports provides leverage over American domestic politics during food security crises when food prices become politically salient. Financial integration between Chinese and Mexican institutions creates opportunities for economic warfare that exploit American financial system vulnerabilities. Chinese banks operating in Mexico provide services to American companies while collecting intelligence about American business operations and financial capabilities. Chinese investment funds purchasing Mexican assets establish Chinese ownership of infrastructure that serves American commercial and security interests. When crisis comes, Chinese financial institutions in Mexico could simultaneously freeze American business operations, disrupt American supply chains, and destabilize American currency relationships. Chinese economic warfare through Mexican territory would appear as Mexican government decisions rather than Chinese attacks, while producing American economic damage that serves Chinese strategic objectives. Port facilities represent critical infrastructure where Chinese strategy becomes most apparent. Chinese companies invest in Mexican Pacific coast ports that handle increasing amounts of Chinese goods destined for American markets while establishing Chinese control over strategic infrastructure near American territory. Chinese logistics operations at Mexican ports collect intelligence about American trade patterns while positioning Chinese capabilities for potential disruption of American commerce during any future crisis. Chinese control over Mexican port facilities provides China with ability to monitor American military movements, disrupt American supply chains, and potentially support Chinese naval operations in Pacific waters without requiring Chinese territorial sovereignty. Mexican port facilities under Chinese control become Chinese strategic assets regardless of Mexican government intentions or preferences. The port of Lázaro Cárdenas, increasingly dominated by Chinese operations, could serve as a Chinese naval facility during wartime while maintaining Mexican sovereignty. Manufacturing relocation from China to Mexico appears to serve American interests by reducing direct Chinese imports, while actually serving Chinese interests by embedding Chinese capabilities within American trade networks. Chinese companies establish Mexican manufacturing operations that maintain Chinese ownership and technological control while gaining access to American markets through USMCA provisions. Intelligence operations through Mexico provide Chinese security services with access to American territory and American institutions that direct Chinese presence cannot achieve. Chinese personnel working for ostensibly Mexican companies or institutions collect intelligence about American military facilities, technological capabilities, and strategic planning while maintaining plausible deniability about intelligence missions. Chinese technology companies establish Mexican operations that provide legitimate access to American technology networks while facilitating intelligence collection about American technological capabilities. Chinese intelligence services use Mexican territory as a staging area for operations against American targets, while exploiting Mexican sovereignty to limit American counterintelligence responses. American intelligence agencies cannot operate freely in Mexican territory to counter Chinese activities, while Chinese operatives move freely between Mexico and America using legitimate commercial and academic cover. Chinese artificial intelligence companies operating in Mexico develop capabilities that monitor American social media, financial transactions, and personal communications while appearing to serve Mexican market development. The timeline for Chinese strategy through Mexico reflects Chinese understanding of American political cycles. Chinese investments accelerate during American election years when domestic politics focus on immigration rather than strategic threats. Chinese strategy anticipates American recognition of Chinese penetration while calculating that American responses will be limited by Mexican sovereignty concerns and domestic political divisions. Chinese strategy creates demonstration effects that encourage other Latin American countries to pursue Chinese partnerships while distancing themselves from American relationships. Chinese success in Mexico provides template for Chinese expansion throughout Latin America that gradually excludes American influence while establishing Chinese regional dominance. American strategic responses to Chinese penetration through Mexico face fundamental constraints that Chinese planners have anticipated and exploited. America cannot treat Mexico as an adversary without destroying USMCA benefits. America cannot restrict Mexican access to American markets without violating trade agreements. America cannot interfere with Mexican sovereignty without contradicting American principles about democratic self-determination. Chinese capabilities in Mexico position China to create American domestic crises that force American accommodation with Chinese demands regardless of American strategic preferences. Chinese ability to disrupt American supply chains, create American energy shortages, and generate American social instability through Mexican territory provides China with coercive capabilities that direct military threats cannot match. The Mexican government faces impossible choices between economic development that requires Chinese investment and security cooperation that serves American interests. Mexican domestic priorities favor Chinese partnership, while Mexican geographic reality requires American accommodation. Chinese success in Mexico demonstrates broader Chinese strategy for using geographic proximity and economic integration to achieve strategic objectives that direct military confrontation cannot accomplish. American failure to prevent Chinese penetration through Mexico reflects broader American strategic weaknesses that prioritize short-term economic benefits over long-term security considerations. American trade policies that create Chinese opportunities reflect American inability to integrate economic and security planning. The strategic conclusion is that China has successfully established Mexico as a platform for economic warfare against America while using American trade agreements and democratic principles as weapons against American security interests. Chinese capabilities in Mexico position China to damage American economy, destabilize American society, and constrain American strategic options during future confrontations. Mexico has become China's secret weapon, not through Mexican choice, but through Chinese strategy that exploited Mexican economic desperation and American strategic blindness. The weapon is now loaded, aimed, and ready for use when Chinese leadership determines that confrontation with America requires activation of capabilities that have been built systematically over decades of apparent commercial cooperation. American recognition of Chinese strategy through Mexico comes too late to prevent Chinese success, but early enough to understand the scope of Chinese achievement.